It's great to be back. So thank you very much. And thank you for all of the companies and teams that entered the pitching competition. And I only got to see the 8 finalists in the last round. That was very impressive. All excellent presentations, very hard to select the best ones, but we will be doing that after my keynote presentation. So the topic for my presentation this evening, my time, and this afternoon, your time, I want to talk about how VCs select companies for investment, because I think is hopefully relevant and useful for the companies that are in the pitching competition and startups in general. It's a very difficult job to be a VC selecting companies for investment. Of course, it's also very difficult to be a startup pitching to VCs for investment. And one of the companies that we saw pitching today was talking about how different sides can say different things with different meanings, and that can also be highly relevant for VCs and startups pitching. So hopefully I'll try to clarify a few key points from the VC perspective that'll help the startups or entrepreneurs who are listening to this presentation to improve their pitching in the future situations where they meet with VCs. So the way I like to think about what VCs look for in a startup at the high level, as a VC, when we listen to a startup pitch, we're trying to identify a company that will be #1 in their product category, in their market, within the next 5 to 10 years. And when I say #1, I really mean #1. I don't mean #2 or #3, but #1. Because of the way that venture capital investment works, we are conduits for investors who would like to add very high risk, high return assets to their investment portfolios. So we need to invest in companies that have the potential to generate very high returns. And this mission is further complicated by the fact that most of the companies that we invest in are likely to either fail or not deliver a return more than the investment that we put into the company. So in order to generate a high enough return across the whole portfolio, we need to make sure that each company that we invest in has the potential to deliver a very high return. I usually will say, to set a benchmark, that we need to invest in companies that can deliver a 30x return to us over a period of 5 to 10 years. On investment, and this is after taking into account dilution. So that's a very tall order, and in reality, only about 3% of the companies that we invest in will be able to do that. But that's the challenge that we face. So how do we invest in companies that are going to deliver such an outsized return? The type of companies that typically deliver that level of outsized return are companies who are just starting out in emerging market sectors that are growing very quickly, or that are slated to grow very quickly over the next, let's say, 5 years. And when a new market sector, new market segment occurs or appears, companies that get into that segment at the right time and then are able to grow quickly along with the sector and come to dominate that sector tend to be companies that can deliver the required return. So if you think about, for example, investing in Uber 10 or 11 years ago when ride sharing was just emerging, or investing in Airbnb when this type of accommodation sharing was just emerging, that those two markets grew very quickly, and the companies that became #1 in those markets delivered very high returns to their early investors. So that's what we need to do. That's what we're looking for in the companies that are pitching. And, you know, to put this in context with what we're doing today, we're at Expara, we see that we believe that there's an emerging new market segment that we're calling Vertech, which are companies that are not just developing right now products and services to deal with the current pandemic, but are companies that are doing that, plus companies that are inventing, developing, or getting ready to launch products and services that are designed to deal with the new problems and challenges that people and organizations will be facing post-pandemic, and also likely will be facing in the throes of future pandemics, assuming that this is not the last pandemic that we're going to see. So in our program, the Expara Vertech program, we're trying to identify now companies, startup companies who have the potential to become number one in their product category within that market. Now, it could be a global market, ideally. If not, it could be a regional or even country-specific market if the country market is big enough. So that's how VCs fundamentally, I believe, or most of the VCs that I know or have talked to or read about, and select the companies that they invest in. Companies that have the potential to become number one in their product category, in their market, in a fast-growing segment within the next 5 to 10 years, because those are the companies that can deliver the required return. And that sounds great, and if you can do that, that would be wonderful. But how to identify those companies today? It's not something where you can just look at a company, listen to a pitch, and then determine that that company is going to become number one in their product category in their market in the next 5 to 10 years. To make a determination today which companies have the highest potential to do that, we will further break down that problem into key elements, what I call key elements for success, which are characteristics of companies, startup companies, that indicate that they have an above average potential to become the number one company in a fast growing market segment. So what are those leading indicators? And you might have been able to tell some of them from the questions that you heard me and other Expara team members asking during the pitch. So the first thing that we look for is innovation. What is the company's innovation? Innovation means something new and useful. What is I like to think about it this way. What is the difficult problem that this company has solved? And that can be technology innovation. It doesn't have to be. Not all of the exciting innovations that drive successful, scalable startups are technology. A lot tend to be, but not all are. And it can be a business model innovation. It can be a process innovation, materials innovation, a user experience innovation. But we want to see something innovative about that company. If the company is not an innovator, then they're a me too, or a company that's copying what somebody else has done, a fast follower. And those companies can also become successful. So there are many companies that are not innovators, but do become successful. So we usually will say, we'll look at it, there are 3 waves of startups in every new market: the innovators who come first, the imitators who copy the innovators, and the third category, the idiots who enter the market way too late. So of course, we're not going to look at that third wave, but the first 2 waves, innovators and imitators, will contain many successful companies. In fact, there may be more successful imitators than innovators because by definition, there'll be many imitators for each innovator, but the innovators in the category are the ones that typically tend to generate the highest returns. And bottom line is we need to invest in the companies that are going to deliver the highest returns. But just having an innovation, it's not enough. When we have an innovation that is not addressing a painful customer problem, we call that a solution seeking a problem. A solution seeking a problem is also not going to become a company that delivers the required return. So second thing we look for in the success in the startup to invest in is what is the painful problem that that startup is addressing with their innovation? Why do we want to why do we want to invest in startups who are solving painful problems? Because painful problems drive demand, and especially pain drives demand. I've been saying this for many years. This is, I've been talking about this framework for almost the last 20 years of investing in startups and teaching entrepreneurship. And I've said so many times, pain drives demand, but we have, I don't think, ever been in a situation that illustrates that more fully than the current pandemic. And we see how the pain, the horrible and tragic pain that's being caused by this pandemic is driving demand in many new markets. And we believe that this is going to continue, after the pandemic has hopefully already peaked and after it starts to wind down. So we want to see startups with innovative products, services, or business models that solve painful problems for customers. Because if they're addressing a painful problem, it's likely that the startup will avoid the most likely first cause of failure of startups who fail, which is there was insufficient demand for their product. When startups address painful problems, the probability that there will be sufficient demand for the product goes way up. So once we have identified a startup who is solving a painful problem for customers, then we want to look at how big is the market that they are addressing and how fast is that market growing. And this is extremely important because if you go back and think about the goal that we have for the financial return in the startup, that it's going to deliver something like a 30x return for us over the next 5 to 10 years. This means it's going to have to grow very big, very fast. In order for the startup to grow very big, very fast, it will be much easier for it to do that. It's never easy to do that, but it'll be relatively easier for the startup to do that in a market that is itself growing fast. If a startup is trying to grow or needs to grow very big, very fast in a market that is itself growing very slowly, this means they will be always swimming against the tide, and they will be required to grow by taking customer share away from existing competitors. Because if the market's not growing, this means it's not adding new customers. If the market's not adding new customers and you're a new company in that market, you can only grow through taking customers away from competitors. And competitors in slow growth markets are going to try to hold on to their customers very tightly. So this is not an attractive market opportunity for a high growth startup. An attractive market opportunity for a high growth startup is a market that is itself growing fast. And in that case, the startup can fuel its growth by just capturing its share of new customers that are entering the market. And it can, if the market itself is, let's say, doubling every year, then the startup could relatively easily double every year just by capturing its share of that growth. And if it can capture more than its share, it can grow even faster. Second thing is we want to make sure that not only is the market growing fast, but it's growing fast enough so that it will reach a sufficient size by the time that we are looking to exit the investment, meaning that by the time the startup is ready to go to an IPO or trade sale, we want to make sure that the market is big enough to support the type of valuation that the company will need to have to successfully execute IPO or a large trade sales strategy. The next thing that we want to see in the company, in the startup company, so they have an innovative product that's solving a painful problem for customers in a fast-growing market, and they have an effective strategy for entering that market and for owning the first segment that they enter, and then for moving from that segment into another segment, and then repeating that until they become the market leader. So we like to see that the startup has a clearly identified entry segment, and that they have a clear way to communicate their value proposition to that segment, and that they deeply understand the segment. And ideally, if they have already launched the product that they're into that segment, that they're getting real traction in the segment. So either they have a lot of customers already, or they're growing very quickly within their target segment, or the customers that are using the product in the target segment really love the product. So we also want to make sure that we also want to invest in startups that may not currently, but will have positive unit economics in their sales and distribution, so that they are ultimately able to, for each product that they sell, acquire the customer for that product at less than the lifetime value of that customer. This often is not the case at the point that we're talking to the startup, because we tend to invest very early, but the startup needs to have a plan to do that, and we need to be confident in that plan. The next thing that we want to see in the startup is that the startup has the ability to compete when others enter, because even if the startup can do all of the things that I just described to be and get themselves into that entry segment and come to dominate it, in order to really own the market, they're going to have to beat the competition. And beating competition is very difficult, because there are a lot of strong entrepreneurs out there who are going to be the imitators of the innovator startup, and there are large companies that are also going to probably try to challenge a startup if the market is attractive enough. So we want to make sure that the startup has proprietary intellectual properties, meaning that they know something that everybody else doesn't know, and B, strategies, competitive strategies that enable them to create barriers to entry for followers, so that they can defend their early mover position and go become the last mover in that market segment, and ultimately the market leader. And the next thing that we look at, although it's not the last, it's last in the order that I've described it, but it's not the least important. In fact, it's the most important thing, is the team. So we look for a strong team that can execute on the plan that I've just described. And I like to say the three most important factors to summarize, I like to say the three most important factors in choosing which startup to invest in as a VC are the team, and the team. And that doesn't mean the other factors are not important, but it means that we believe that a strong team will succeed no matter what, and a weak team will screw up the best idea in the world. It's sort of like real estate investment, where we focus on location. Why do we say that about real estate and say team about startup? Because the location is the only thing about the piece of property that cannot be changed, and the team is the only thing about the startup that cannot be changed. Now, of course, teams may change later, but we're investing in this team, and we expect this team to be the one to take the company to the success that we're talking about. So those are my key points and tips for startups presenting to VCs. I think those are, most VCs will look at those elements and maybe a few more, maybe a few less, but if you're able to present those effectively, the vast majority of VCs will be able to evaluate whether they think your company is a good investment or not. And I would like to thank all of you for your kind attention for my keynote speech, and very much looking forward to the announcement of the winner in the competition. But I want to finish my speech by saying in a competition like this, there are no losers. So it's not that there are winner and losers. There are only winners and learners. This is all about startups learning how to present effectively to VCs. And I can sincerely say that I saw many out of the 8 companies that I saw, I felt many of these companies are investable. I hope that all of the companies that presented in the finals and all the companies even that didn't make it to the finals will apply for the Expara VC competition accelerator program. And we have announced today that we've extended the application deadline for another 11 days because we have so many companies that have already filled out applications but are still completing. And I strongly encourage you, whether you were semi-finalist, finalist or not, apply for the program, and I hope that we will see you again in our online accelerator program in May. So thank you very much.